Ladies and gentlemen, this is our second panel, Canadian National Security in the New Middle East. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mr. Raymond Boisvert, a member of CSIS since its inception in 1984. Mr. Boisvert has been at the forefront of Canadian law enforcement and intelligence for over 30 years. He has worked in the fields of counterintelligence and counterterrorism. He became Chief of IO Recruitment, the Director's Executive Assistant, Regional Chief of Physical Surveillance, Foreign Collection Officer, National Chief, and Special Operations Security. He has served both as Deputy Director General and Director General of Human Sources and Operational Support Breach. In 2009, he was appointed Director General of the International Terrorism Branch, and in 2010, he assumed the role of Assistant Director of Intelligence. We are very proud to have Mr. Boisvert as our moderator and to hear his insight and analysis for this important panel.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for organizing this very important event. Before I begin with my opening remarks, I'd like to introduce my co-panelists, please. To my immediate left is Superintendent Doug Best. He's an old friend. We've shared some time together in different organizations over the years. He's currently the Assistant Criminal Operations Officer, responsible for national security at RCMP O Division here in Toronto. He began his career 34 years ago by joining the RCMP from Newfoundland, later moving to Toronto to work in organized crime, drugs, and commercial crime. He joined the RCMP Security Service, which is our predecessor organization at CSIS, back in 1981, and stayed with the service when it became CSIS in 1984. He then worked both counterintelligence and counterterrorism fields, but then returned to the RCMP in 1996 to the Air India Task Force. Doug was commissioned as an officer in 2005. He took up a variety of senior roles in national security, border integrity, protective operations in British Columbia before taking on his current role in 2010. Over his career, he's particularly proud of his results. He's been a great collaborator and has spoken very well, or is very spoken well of by many of us in the business. He's been a great collaborator and an outstanding investigator. Further to my left is somebody who probably needs no introduction because he's been a fixture in a number of very important debates and discussions. But John Thompson is, as you know, the director of the Mackenzie Institute. He directs research and field work into issues relating to domestic and international political stability, organized violence, strategic analysis, and intelligence. He's also given over 7,000 media interviews, lectures, and public appearances, and has been published in numerous columns, op-ed pieces, and a variety of research papers. He's testified before the U.S. Congress, Canadian parliamentary and Senate committees, and has been involved in policy development in Canada for a number of years, as well as in the UK and the US. He's assisted a number of organizations in developing competitive intelligence functions, strategic reviews, and has facilitated the creation of trade policies. I get the honor of beginning this panel with providing you with an overview of the threat environment and taking a look at it first in the broader context, but also with respect to, and obviously the purpose of our discussion today, or the focus of the conference, the Middle East itself. Now, the threat environment is important in a more global or grander sense because everything is interconnected. The world's interconnected. The threat environment is greatly interconnected. What happens globally, what happens in the Middle East, has implications for Canada as well. Now, the Middle East itself is, though, particularly important for people in my business. It's been the centerpiece of a lot of our work over the last 10 years, and probably for no greater reason than 9/11. And the aftermath thereof. As I said to many of my partners over the years, and having been the Principal Director General responsible for the counterterrorism program at CSIS, I've always been amazed on how increasingly complex, interconnected, all these elements, these disparate elements of the threat environment have grown exponentially over the last 5 years, to a point where I remember looking at my Deputy Director General last year and staring him in the face after he's explaining a very complex case of 2 young Canadians moving offshore, wanting to engage in jihad, and us trying to move information offshore to intercept them, but also trying to ensure their safety in a very, very difficult world of information sharing. and all of the ramifications that are connected to that. And at one point staring at him and saying, "You really can't make this up, can you?" And that's reality at CSIS today, and that's the reality that the RCMP and we share as well with respect to the counterterrorism investigations. But first, let me say a couple words about the role of CSIS in this realm. We navigate threats to national security in the threat environment for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we are a security service. Our mandate is to keep Canadians safe and secure. That's what we do best, and that's what we do in terms of how we manage our target sets and how we pursue our investigations. But we're more than that. We became more than that in the last number of years because we were driven towards having a duality. And the duality was also to be a provisioner of important intelligence which would help shape government decision-making. And that, I believe, has been perhaps our greatest success in the last 5 years. But now let me speak a bit more about the threat environment itself. As I said, it's volatile, it's extremely unpredictable. It covers the areas of espionage, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, etc., etc. Although at CSIS we currently manage about 80% of our resources or dedicate those strictly to the counterterrorism area, we are ever more observing the reemergence of the intelligence threat, and of course our role in counterintelligence becomes ever more important. And I will also, later on in the presentation, give you a sense of how critical the cyber piece has been with respect to the new espionage. So the new reality is the threats are diverse, they're widespread, and the very big difference in Canada, and the biggest significant change with respect to us and our business and what it means to you as Canadians is that the service engages now that threat wherever it may reside. We're no longer a strictly defensive security service, which then tries to identify cells, plots, individuals who may become radicalized or are plotting to steal intellectual property. We're actually engaging those threats offshore to ensure that we can do our best to prevent them from arriving within this country. A couple little angles that make it interesting, of course. We're in the age of immediacy. We're in the age of media and information. It's the 24-hour news cycle, it's the internet, it's also the virtual communities. These both represent challenges and also some great opportunities for us. At one point, or for example, just to give you a sense of what I mean, on one side of the equation, we're shameless data exploiters. On the other side, we're at the same, we have to manage our cyber identities or our online activities the same way that banks, financial institutions, or yourselves as citizens do. Also, in terms of trends and other type of things that happen, we also look at the way the Arab Spring, of course, has really changed the dynamic in the Middle East, has greatly affected the al-Qaeda narrative, and greatly affected the way we've seen that threat emerge from the Middle East and North Africa. But I'll come back to that issue in a few moments. Just to digress a little bit, because I think it's an interesting issue, I thought of it a couple of days ago. I was going through these notes and preparing my speaking points, was the issue of the information age. I was just mentioning to Jason a few minutes ago that we've done a number of very interesting conferences through our academic outreach program. And one of those most important was called Informing Instability. And it really was all about the media and was about trying to understand the world as it's changing and how we can exploit, ensure that we can do our investigative activity and collect intelligence in the most effective manner. We followed up with a conference on foresight because we really need to be able to evolve and change the way we do our business at such a rapid pace that I frankly quite often wonder how we currently manage these large, we often refer to them as fire hoses of data information coming at us. So it drives us to become very creative and innovative in what we do. But I also came back to a quote that I used at the conference when I was giving one of the early, actually in fact the introductory comments on the Foresight Conference, and I quoted Joseph Nye. And he said that the security intelligence community, or the security intelligence dilemma, is really two parts. It's about secrets, and it's about mysteries. Secrets are, for example, for us, a human collection, a human intelligence collection, or a technical intercept, which would give us a sense of how many numbers of divisions do the Syrian army currently have under their control. The mystery part would be more the other half of that question, which would be how many of those divisions will actually remain loyal to the regime should the area or the environment deteriorate. That's part of our challenge, is understanding things, making sense of them, and giving foresight or giving some sort of insights to government decision makers. And again, in this threat environment, extremely difficult. But I'll come back to that point in the context of the Arab Spring in a few moments. The last thing I'll say, though, on that is I guess I'm continuously challenged because I have way too many mysteries and so far not enough secrets to help me manage those mysteries. And of course, I guess the other part is that with WikiLeaks and other things, there are actually far fewer mysteries or secrets that remain on the scene. Let me speak about the issue of espionage. I've typically done presentations, and I always speak about or always talk about the counterterrorism threat because it is the most important one being faced by Canadians. But many of us in our business always had a very, very deep sense of apprehension because the intelligence threat itself never diminished after the end of the Cold War. It just morphed and transformed. It had a slight lull. But what changed is that we shifted our focus to the counterterrorism environment because that represented the single most important threat. But as time moves on and we see a number of stories, you've heard about reports in the media about Nortel losing its intellectual property. There are questions of a number of cyber attacks coming around the world from different key accusations of the PRC, China, and Russia being engaged in these sort of activities, as we've seen through open media. But really, it's all about the economy. It's all about competitiveness, and it's all about being ahead and having interests. The levels of hostile foreign espionage, as I said, really rivals that of the Cold War age. And it is focused really on those two critical issues, the politics and the economy. The potential loss of technology, materials, expertise is such a significant threat to Canadians is that I think we're finally ourselves, collectively as a community of Canadians, starting to take notice that this is perhaps our future that's at stake. Another threat element that's quite often just below the radar, but one that we as a service have spoken to frequently, is the issue of foreign interference. We are a community of communities. We're a country of immigrants. We average approximately 250,000 new Canadians every year. With very few exceptions. They integrate exceptionally well, and it's a point of pride as Canadians. And I know as I travel and benchmark our business with other security intelligence services around the world, they often comment on how the Canadian environment is so unique in so many ways, not the least of which has been our success in multiculturalism. But foreign governments they have historically, and they will continue to target new Canadians, and they'll continue to target ethnic and cultural communities across the country to gain advantage, to gain insights, and to influence outcomes. Cybersecurity. As I've said time and time again, I like framing it or characterize it in the following ways. It's pervasive and it's persistent. The worst part is you'll probably not even know it's happening. And that's part of the unique nature of the cyber and the new espionage environment that we're currently facing. It's directed against the Government of Canada, Government Canadian agencies and ministries, and the private sector. It's being perpetrated by state and non-state actors, and we've heard of the community of hacktivists who do it for a number of motivations, but nevertheless quite often put at risk or do direct harm to critical elements of our society and increasingly towards critical infrastructure. What's also quite troubling in this environment is that there's a growing range of sophisticated tools and techniques that are increasingly and readily available on the internet. Young individuals can download the equivalent of the Stuxnet virus, which became famous through the attack on the control systems related to Iranian nuclear programs, and which that in itself now has become itself a viral platform that is available for others to use. Now, I probably shouldn't characterize it as viral, but it has the potential, given the ubiquitous nature of these very, very sophisticated tools and their accessibility through the internet. The challenge, of course, for us, the challenge for business, the challenge for individuals protecting their own identity is the growing range of these sophisticated tools are increasingly, as I say, difficult to detect and very, very difficult to prevent. It therefore represents a really important security threat and a threat to our prosperity as well. I'll finish off my last thought on that is that quite often as well, it's not just the usual suspects. There are a number of emerging countries that are using these sophisticated techniques and are using them for a variety of reasons, but again, focused on economics and political outcomes. Another important issue for us is proliferation. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and it's in itself a very difficult issue to manage for investigative purposes. A number of technologies are dual use, and I think you understand by its very name, developing a technology that has a civilian application or has a very benign application can quite often, depending on the type of device, be used for other purposes. The end user certificates, the end use of those particular acquisitions can also be problematic for customs and other investigative organizations. It's a threat to Canada, it's a threat to our allies, it's a threat to the international community. It involves both state and non-state actors. It is the DPRK, it is North Korea, as much as it is the question of al-Qaeda. Many are also engaged in the technological procurement for the issue of this ability to transform, to reverse engineer, to be able to build things out of perhaps not the initial engineering concept of the device, but one which could be modified, which would then further the needs or requirements of the proliferators. Let me now move towards the heart of the issue in terms of the most important aspects, as I said, in terms of the global threat environment. And it's about terrorism. It's about the globalized nature of it. It actually means is that it's reduced the barriers to violence that we used to assume, given distance, given travel requirements, and given the apparatus of security establishment to be able to overcome. 9/11 changed our perspective on that tremendously. Technology, mobility, has allowed the few the potential to cause a considerable amount of harm. It's not just about al-Qaeda senior leadership. It's not about the affiliates, as we call them, the al-Qaeda organizations represented in different parts of the world. And it's not just the individuals, but all of them are interconnected. It's also about, increasingly, you've certainly read about this in the media, it's about the issue of the lone actor, or the issue of the small group. It's the active shooter scenario we just witnessed in France recently with Mohammed Merah. And it's also the issue of Anders Breivik in Norway back in 2011 in the summer. To assume that we are immune to that, given the great strength of our multicultural identity, given the, I guess the reasonable argument of social and economic equity, or equality, perhaps. But the issue of radicalization is very, very strong. It's having great effect, and the possibilities of a lone actor is increasingly possible. And it's possible because we're increasingly concerned about domestic extremism. There's a reemergence of this ideological extremism. It goes beyond what we have been again focusing on in terms of those who are influenced by the al-Qaeda narrative. It's now also about multi-issue extremism, that is of the left and of the right, of the extreme left and right. It's about as much the violent anarchist movement to the sovereign citizen movement we've seen in the United States, where several law enforcement officers have been shot and killed by persons who identify with a sovereigntist movement that does not recognize the powers of the state. We're also influenced by global social, economic, and political issues that are affecting domestic extremism. Probably just a quick image pops into my mind is the firebombing of the Royal Bank in Ottawa, in sleepy Ottawa, where I reside, in probably one of the most sort of upper middle class neighborhoods, the Glebe, and from a group that allegedly would have been characterized as being from the extreme left. This is not about lawful advocacy, protest, and dissent. We're very conscious of that, and we only engage when there's a question of serious violence to achieve a political objective. Now, let me shift our discussion towards the issue at hand, which is really a bit more towards the al-Qaeda narrative and what I still believe as being the root cause of concern in the counterterrorism environment that I work in. It is the primary threat facing the West. It is via al-Qaeda core elements, but as I mentioned just a few moments ago, and I'm not sure how many people focus on the affiliates, but the affiliates, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, there's AQI in Iraq, there's those who believe there's AQA, AQ in America. There are a number of recognized and aspirants who do subscribe to Osama bin Laden's vision of the base and that the Ummah, the greater Islamic community, is under threat. Therefore, the environment we observe, the environment we investigate, and the environment we collect intelligence against is focused in the Middle East, it's focused in North Africa, but it has direct linkages and effect back in Canada. So we're talking about AQ-inspired homegrown extremism, again, to be even more specific. It is the primary domestic threat. It's inspired by AQ. It involves indoctrination and radicalization. Many blame the internet. I'm not one who subscribes to that theory. It's bigger than that. The internet certainly has facilitated the ability for persons, sometimes individuals alone, to become deeply radicalized. But quite often, and we've done a lot of work studying this issue, in fact, one of the units that works under my area of intelligence has developed a number of cross-cutting intelligence assessment tools strictly and dedicated to the issue of radicalization because it's such a complex and difficult issue to understand. We, for example, going back to my days in the counterterrorism branch, one of the most challenging issues for us was trying to determine when a young radicalized individual would tip towards violence. When would that person go from, we often used to refer to him as a couch jihadist, somebody who'd sit at home, spend time on the internet with tremendous levels of vitriol, but would never ever engage in attack planning, or never gave us the indication that he would engage in attack planning. It's a real art, I can tell you. We do apply the science. We apply a number of advanced analytics to look at determinants, look at leads, but at the end of the day, understanding when that person moves towards this deep radicalization towards attack planning is a very, very challenging issue for us. But usually when it does happen, and hence my comment about the internet, it usually involves others. And quite often involves an influential person in that individual's life. One of the best iconic elements that emerged in the last few years was AQIP's Inspire magazine. Anwar Laki and Samir Khan, who are no longer with us, were behind the magazine's construction. Very glossy, very interesting, high production values. We probably would have put a Madison Avenue advertising firm to shame, and it was having some market penetration, if I'm going to use the same sort of private sector analogies. It was being read. It was influencing young men. Most of it involved simply encouraging people to become a lone actor, to take that truck, that pickup truck, and drive it down that pedestrian mall and crush as many people as you can. That's the sort of thing that thankfully does not resonate with the vast, vast majority of Canadians, but it has the potential, and it's extremely malevolent. But we're not alone as well. Of course, I don't have to recite all the newspaper articles. Activities across Spain, the UK, France, as I mentioned earlier, are all seeing the same sort of cause and effect. So with the AQ, so what does it mean now that Osama bin Laden is also no longer with us? Is it over? Has the threat diminished? It's a very fair question. It's one that we must answer effectively because the only thing we could do worse than underestimating a threat is actually overstating it as we give advice to government. It's still a very important factor in the equation. It's still about that single narrative. It's a strong narrative, it's alive, and it still resonates. And in fact, there's questions of the martyrdom legacy of Osama bin Laden and Anwar Laki, and what that means in terms of its motivational value for young men, and increasingly young women. We continue to see recruitments occur in the West. We see radicalization growing, and we see numbers of people who then commit to jihad and to a violent jihadi outcome. Let me speak a bit more about the AQ affiliates, moving off from what happens post-Osama bin Laden. The operational torch, in our view, has been passed. It's gone from the initiator, which was AQ. It's moved on to the affiliates. It's a very delicate balance for al-Qaeda senior leadership. It's a very, very complicated equation for them. It's clear that these affiliates have the intent and they have a growing level of capability, mostly focused locally, increasingly reaching globally. AQAP is one of my favorites. It's in Yemen. It's proven to be has a significant interest in targeting the West. You'll recall the infamous 2009 underwear bomber on the Christmas Day flight over Detroit in 2009. There were some groundbreaking technologies that were launched in 2010, the printer cartridge bombing plots. And then, of course, we've seen, of course, the mayhem unleashed partially as a result through activities related to the Arab Spring, as it's so called, and it resulted many of AQAP, through that chaos, gained some capability and a stronger foothold, at least for the time being. AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it's returned. It was under incredible stress and duress, as has been Al-Qaeda senior leadership because of security military operations in the Fatah, but it's also becoming a very significant piece, and we're very, very mindful of that. It's also now the issue of AQIM and what's happening on the Islamic Maghreb and what's happening with respect to their ability to acquire a great number of weapons through Libya and other countries that have gone through upheaval. And it's also been a case of them becoming stronger and focused through alliances, both south in Nigeria, Boko Haram, and moving back north through as far east as dealing with Al-Shabaab in East Africa or Somalia specifically. So let me now take you to the main points. I want to go back, now that I've given you this background in terms of how we do our business to some degree, what sort of things keep us awake at night, what sort of things we're challenged with, and what sort of things I think we're doing very successfully. I want to give you a sense that in the context of the Arab Spring and with respect to the Middle East, it's big. It's probably is the microcosm of a lot of these issues on the counterterrorism front are probably very well represented there. The big question, though, is will political upheaval diminish or increase the threat to Canadian security interests? I'll go back to Joseph Nye because he's handy, and I'll go back because it also, I think, sets the issue particularly well. As he said, intelligence is really a mystery with no clear answers. So what we have right now as we face the whole Arab Spring aftermath is it's practically, in many senses, too early to tell what the answer to that important question is. And there are also a large number of possible outcomes. Is there cause for optimism? Yes, I believe there is, and I truly believe there is. There's the possibility of genuine democratic reform. People are mobilizing, true. Will we see something emerge along the lines of a Turkish model for wherever people may draw as conclusions in terms of being the most appropriate or less than appropriate? What's happening in Egypt? Well, let's look at what's happened with the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's look at the Salafist organized groups, the political parties. They have engaged the political process. They do, I believe at this point, believe that there's a lot at stake, and a lot at stake with respect to trying to grind out some sort of positive political outcome that will benefit most, but not all. And of course, they all recognize that the implications regionally are tremendous. On the Libyan piece, it's a little bit more complicated, but there's also perhaps even greater hope because there are perhaps greater number of resources. Yes, no civil society, no evidence of it, no history of it, but so far the squabbling amongst the factions, the squabbling amongst the militias has been somewhat restrained, and that again, the international community is very much engaged in trying to ensure that Libya is a successful outcome. The other really positive piece to this, and everybody remembers the news footage. We all recall what drove the particular street demonstrations, what toppled regimes. We all draw perhaps different conclusions. Was it as much the miracle of social networking? Was it as much a case of despotic regimes that were just historically doomed? Clearly, one thing that was not, it was not an al-Qaeda-driven event. It was not a call against secular regimes. It wasn't a call for violent jihad. It did not, in fact, al-Qaeda senior leadership did not anticipate the Arab Spring. These uprisings were, for the most part, non-ideological, and they were intergenerational. There was a common desire to oust autocratic leaderships, or leaders, and they were inspired by political, social, and economic grievances. So, not bad. But certainly, again, not by radical Islamist extremist agenda. But there's also some concern as well. It's not all great. As we heard from the previous panel, there's a mixed set of reviews. There is a regional history that lacks any democratic foundation. In Egypt, there's frustration with the slow pace of change. We've seen that demonstrated in renewed demos in Cairo and elsewhere. Anti-regime protests may evolve to something more, and we may see different variants which may not be the positive kind. There's also a general uncertainty about the overall instability. What worries me most, and I'm a bit of a student of history, is that usually the best organized groups succeed through chaos, and that way may allow those with strong religious affiliations the upper hand. AQ efforts to exploit the political upheaval is, I think, extremely stalled. It's immature and probably not likely to succeed. I have a feeling that as Al-Qaeda struggles to identify its voice, they've had a couple of haphazard media communications which were quite ham-handed. I also want to say that we've ended up with a situation where we do, though, notwithstanding the AQ's misfire and its inability to focus in on the potential of this, the upheavals, we do have a bunch of affiliates who have not completely missed out on understanding how all those dots are going to connect and how they're exploiting it. I'll finish off with a couple of quick thoughts here. I'm probably into overtime as it is. Looking ahead, AQ activities will likely continue. No surprise to anybody. Further uncertainty and potential destabilization will certainly be a factor. The Iran question is an important one. We haven't touched much on that. Iran's support to terrorism in this region remains important, and it's not contributing to a positive situation. Overall, though, in terms of, I can finish off on a positive note, in terms of how we do our business and the certain level of confidence I have in how we conduct our affairs in the interest of Canadians, I can say that Canada is not facing and not seeing this threat environment in any sort of unique or singular fashion. We're sharing intelligence, we're sharing information, and we are collaborating both domestically and overseas. We're looking at things, we're gauging interdependencies, and we're looking at unpredictability. We're trying to make a lot of sense out of these emerging trends and trying to make some meaning, something understandable so government can be well informed to make the right decisions. We're connecting lots of dots, both at the micro and macro levels, and we're trying to really clearly distinguish between opportunities and threats and be very nimble in engaging those threats as they emerge. Ongoing challenges, though, we're going to have to be ever more vigilant because the threat environment, as I said at the very outset, is increasingly complex. We are, I would suggest, your first line of defense. The intelligence community, I should say, collectively is your first line of defense. And in return for that trust, we promise not to be complacent. We will not be unimaginative. We're going to be rigorous in our analysis and assessments. And we're going to be resilient in terms of contributing to overcoming those threats and contributing to the greater Government of Canada enterprise. So we are well-resourced, we're well-managed, we're constantly improving our analytics, and I'm confident that we'll be sure to leave Canadians feeling far more safe and secure, not just in Canada, but as Canadians, Canadian companies, Canadian organizations engage the world. So thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, I want to extend my thank you to the Advocates for Civil Liberties and the Atlantic Council for this opportunity to make this presentation here today. Whenever this sort of opportunity arises, it is always our pleasure to be able to participate. Just as a little introduction, and Ray alluded to it, I'm the officer in charge of their Integrated National Security Enforcement Team here in Ontario, O Division. And when we say integrated, it is truly an integrated unit. I have people under my command that are represented from all the major police services in the Greater Toronto Area, the Ontario Provincial Police, other federal agencies such as CBSA, and as well, last but not least, of course, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And if I just may, on that one particular point, our relationship with all our partners is absolutely fundamental to us performing our duties. And on that line, very recently, within the last year, we were very successful in negotiating or arranging a secondment to our police force, to the RCMP Security Service, National Security, with a representative from CSIS at a senior officer level. And this is the first time certainly in Canadian history that we have had such a secondment at such a senior level. And in turn, I have one of my inspectors down working in the field office in Toronto here. And that has been working very, very well. And as Ray quite correctly stated, terrorism remains a critical threat to Canada. Absolutely it does. The RCMP is responsible. Its responsibility is for preventing, denying, investigating, and responding to the terrorist threat. I would like to say that really one of the most successful programs that we've initiated in recent time has been our community outreach. And we do this by engaging the various communities in the Greater Toronto Area and elsewhere to become engaged, to have an understanding as to what our role is, and we do this in conjunction with the other police forces and with the service, so that people clearly have an understanding of the communities as to what our role is. And again, I'll refer back to Ray and to other speakers. I mean, truly Canada is a mosaic of peoples, and we very much respect our history and multiculturalism. Some of the criticism, I think, I've heard it said or out there that the RCMP is out there targeting communities. Nothing could be absolutely further from the truth. We do not target communities, but what we do investigate is criminal activity. So we've found that the response that we've been receiving from our community outreach program has been absolutely overwhelming. In fact, we're finding it difficult to keep pace with the demand. The feedback has been very, very positive, and we will certainly continue in that endeavor. And I guess if I can use the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it's incumbent upon us to educate the various communities so that it's a shared responsibility. Counterterrorism is in fact a shared responsibility, and it's very encouraging when we see communities reaching out to us, as we've been reaching out to them, because they're concerned of activities they're seeing within the various communities that are causing them concern. And once we become aware of that, there are various means by which interactions can occur. Obviously, it's important that the community engages itself. If the threat is so severe and remediation is not possible, then obviously we become involved in a more sophisticated, I guess, enforcement action, if I may. Another program that we've been successfully operating is what we call our CTIO program, or Counterterrorism Information Officer program. And in this particular program, we go out to the various police forces, private sector, and we speak to them in terms of what we perceive the threat is, pre-incident indicators, and again, the feedback has been very positive, and we're very pleased with the progress we've made in that program. Just a slight or a statistic, if I just may. Studies have indicated that 80% of the terrorist activities that have been foiled have been the result of the community reaching back to the various enforcement agencies. So that's very encouraging. The other part of our program, and again, in line with, I guess, to some extent what Ray was saying, is that we rely heavily on our partners. We do the community outreach, the CTIO program, but in actually detecting, what do we mean when we say we're detecting? Well, obviously we are an intelligence-led organization. We also rely heavily on human information, human intelligence, as well as technical. Now, of course, for our technical intelligence, that requires judicial authorizations, and we must meet a certain threshold before we can get there. Also, we have been very aggressively forging our relationships with our various policing partners and indeed other agencies around the world. I think currently we have representation in approximately, I believe it's about 29 countries abroad. So, you know, we actively engage our liaison officers, and again, it's for the protection of Canadian citizens. The Terrorism Act allows us to conduct interviews of Canadians abroad, which we certainly do in cooperation with the various host agencies. I mentioned that we are an intelligence-driven organization, and some of you may or may not be aware, but historically that's been problematic. And how do you get intelligence from its raw form into something that can be used for evidentiary purposes? And that remains a challenge, but I can say that we have been making tremendous progress in our ability to use raw intelligence, be it from the service or from other Canadian institutions involved in the intelligence gathering process. Certainly, I think everybody here is aware of the Toronto 18 case, and certainly from the rulings that were given by certainly Justice Dawson during the particular case. Some, I think, significant case law was made, and we're expounding on the ability to be able to use that in the very transfer of intel into evidence. So all in all, it's been, it tends to be working well. Just to give you some idea of capacity, you know, I talked about our outreach program earlier. We do have ongoing investigations in the Ontario. Some of them are rather large investigations. We've had successful investigations. We have cases before the courts as I currently speak. But I'll just give you an example of capacity and the importance of having partners in the business. The RCMP alone, in our capacity here in this province, we simply would not have the capacity without the support of our partners. A very recent investigation, which, you know, continues on, has resulted in, you know, a tremendous use of manpower, and we've been able to draw upon the resources of the various police forces, the OPP, the regional police forces, Toronto Metro. So we've been able to, you know, we're able to respond according to the threat. We could say go from personnel of 100 to 300 virtually at a moment's notice. So we're flexible, we're able to respond to the threat as it presents itself. So generally speaking, that is the RCMP's approach and program. And I guess if there's a message I can leave with you is that really we are all in this business together. We rely on our communities to support us, and they have been. Again, I stress the importance of partnerships, both with the community and with our other agencies. And again, I'm very pleased to say, and not just to highlight CSIS, but certainly, as I said, we are an intelligence-driven organization, and we do rely on intel from the service and indeed from other intelligence agencies within government. So thank you very much again for this opportunity, and I hope I haven't been too simplistic in my description here, but just wanted to keep it brief. So thank you again.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to see that so many people here. I know about a third of you, which is why I'm surprised at the heavy attendance. You have just heard from two officers who I can tell you are very, very highly regarded in their community by their peers and by their subordinates. They serve you better than you know. The problem is that they're two organizations that are heavily tasked, under-resourced, underfunded. And you know, when I was in the military, I was told, never say that you're outnumbered, say that you have a target-rich environment. And they have a target-rich environment where the target array just keeps shifting and shifting and popping up, sometimes faster and faster and faster. And it is, of course, the problem of our intelligence services is that no one ever really hears that much about their successes, but everyone does tend to notice their failures. Which also sort of leads to the comment that I actually chose to begin my remarks with today. It was a quote from President Warren Gamble Harding, who's probably not the first U.S. president to feel this way, and probably not the last one either. But he did famously remark in the 1920s, it's not my enemies that keep me up at night, it's my goddamn friends. And when we sort of come to our security issues, our national issues in the Middle East and everything, sometimes it's the friends that keep us up at night. So to talk about the Arab Spring, I'm first going to leap completely out of the Arab world and run across to Pakistan. Because I'm going to be taking advantage of my ability here to speak a little more bluntly than some people can. But Pakistan is our ally in the fight against terrorism. I mean, the war in Afghanistan would go nowhere if our military aircraft were not allowed to fly across Pakistan's airspace. Our supplies that go into Afghanistan tend to go through Pakistani territory and with their permission, and despite the fact that occasionally a mob of their citizens might burn the fuel trucks, but just about everything else does get through. On the other hand, the Al-Qaeda, well, they operate from Pakistani sanctuaries. They were both Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency, had a major hand in helping to create and run them and sustain them. Pakistan, again, you know, you've got a government that is confusing. It's hard to keep track of. You've got all these shifting different elements, a very small sort of Anglophilic elite, different components within the country that, so when they change rapidly, policy changes quickly. Their relationship with India is complicated, so that occasionally, you know, they do support very quietly and tacitly some of the terrorist groups that have attacked India quite famously. When India bristles and starts tugging at its saber sheath, then Pakistan might backpedal and suppress Lashkar-e-Taiba or some of the other groups for a little while. But this is the problem, is that this is our ally, but at the same time, it's part of the threat environment. You know, they cooperate, they provide us with intelligence, but again, famously, the United States, when they finally found Osama bin Laden on Pakistani territory, realized when they're planning the raid, they couldn't tell the Pakistanis, because they wanted Osama bin Laden to still be there when they arrived. That's one of the several problems. There's quite a few like that. To a lesser extent, we have the same issue with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is actually quite predictable in a number of ways. It is an ally. As long as you understand that what Saudi Arabia is fundamentally interested in, or what the Saudi government is fundamentally interested in, is its own survival and the continuing family business of the House of Ibn Saud. Now, they will cooperate with us to protect their own rule and their own interests. And there are some very complicated relationships in the Middle East. And you know, sometimes, again, there's Saudi Arabia, what they officially say about Israel, and there's what they privately do with Israel. They're often very different. But at the same time, you know, with Pakistan, of course, we have this major Islamic sect in Pakistan called the Deobandis, who are actually an offshoot of a major sect in Saudi Arabia called the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis and the Deobandis believe very strongly in the global supremacy of Islam, in the absolute supremacy of Sharia law, the restoration of the caliphate. They are hardline, very extremist religious sects. Bad news. They've been bad news for centuries. The Deobandis out of Pakistan, again, there's the sort of religious, political, missionary arm, Tablighi Jamaat, which has been sponsoring a lot of trouble in Europe, in Britain especially. Again, playing a major role in sort of trying to act as a political front, subversion, dealing with politicians, soft peddling some messages, but inside the Islamic community, trying to keep the youth as militarized as possible. In the immigrant societies like Britain, like us, like the United States, we have found in over 2 centuries, we can absorb almost anybody. But we've never had to deal with a countervailing influence working on some of our communities to prevent some people from integrating with the rest of the community. And that is the role of Tablighi Jamaat with Deobandis. That is the role of the Dawa movement with the Wahhabis to make sure that people who belong to that sect do not fully integrate into our societies. Frankly, we don't know how to deal with this. The Saudi royal family has long had a partnership with the Wahhabis. And there's sort of a complicated carrot and stick approach that the Wahhabis are more or less allowed to set social policy inside Saudi Arabia, which is why you've seen things like, the religious police pushing girls back inside a burning schoolhouse in case, they came out inadequately dressed and the firemen were tempted beyond all possible limitation. Or the stick. If the Wahhabis are too much trouble, they're encouraged to leave. And remember, there was, for example, one incident Saudis would have us forget, which was 1979, the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. About 1,200 people were killed. In fact, the issue was only resolved when the Saudis quietly invited in a couple of French officers, announced they'd temporarily converted to Islam, and they came in as specialists with poison gas to flush out the cellars of the Grand Mosque. That's history. It's not a part of history the Saudis would like to remember. But after that, the Saudis spend a lot of money on the dawah to encourage, stick if you stay here, carrot if you go elsewhere, and to encourage members of the dawah movement to be more aggressive everywhere else. And we see the results of this on our own street. And what's this all got to do with the Arab Spring? Well, I think we may have created more Pakistans of various different flavors. Countries that are our partners in some way, our allies, business partners in many ways, and countries that we might not be able to effectively deal with. Tunisia, for example, we're still seeing what the new government will be, but there's a stronger flavor by Salafists and by the Muslim Brotherhood. And they are sort of like Wahhabi light, but again, they still believe in the supremacy of Sharia law, the restoration of the caliphate. They're not running the country, but they're much more influential than they have been in the past. In Libya, again, the revolt against Gaddafi was for a number of reasons. There was a number of different issues. God knows the man had created his enemies, quite a few of them all over the world. But again, besides the tribal aspect of the revolt against him, despite the frustrated middle class, the organization that had the most coherent history of opposition to Gaddafi, again, were the militants, the ones who'd gone away to Afghanistan to be educated by the Wahhabis, drilled by the Dawa, and of course became associated with Al-Qaeda. And they were back front and center and heavily involved in the revolt, and they're still there. And of course, one of the other things they did was very helpfully when the government collapsed and all these arms warehouses were open, was help themselves to a few items. So we're starting to see things appear elsewhere. The Israelis don't like it when there's artillery rockets in Gaza. They really don't like it when there's SAM-7 missiles. They can shoot down helicopters in Gaza. And of course, we don't like it because if they're in Gaza, where else might these things be? What else might they be fired at? Egypt. Actually, Egypt, again, this is one of the points that I think everyone missed about the Arab Spring. You have this revolt against the existing elites because they're corrupt and they're inefficient. Let's face it, that is sort of the ground state for a lot of governments inside the Arab world. And in Egypt, you have the military elite, been running things since the 1950s under various other leaders, but they were corrupt. And that annoys the middle class. That frustrates the youth who find themselves short on opportunities. It leads to acute inefficiencies in the economy. But this has always been the case. This has been the case for decades. So why did they revolt last year? You remember the footage of the first protests? Housewives holding up loaves of bread? We saw the graphs on oil prices. What do you think the graphs are on food prices right now? They're high, very, very high. They've been very, very high in the last couple of years, bobbing up and down a bit, but food prices are very high. Here, the typical Canadian household may spend less than 10% of their annual budget on groceries. Maybe more if you're a student, less if you're working. In the much of the Islamic world, that might be 40%. And if food prices have gone up by 50% or more, that frightens you. And one thing we always forget about revolutions is that actually it's seventh and last, in the heart of a revolution, hungry people do not commit revolutions. Well, sorry, starving people do not commit revolutions. They commit theft, but they do not commit revolutions. But people who are afraid they're going to be hungry do revolt. That's the story of 1848 in Europe. Lenin, peace, land, bread, because all three of them were in short supply. What were the Nazis doing in the 1932 election? Handing out loaves of bread from trucks. Because the Depression had hit Germany hard. And again, people were getting seriously hungry, and the Nazis were handing out bread. I mean, it's always had a presence in a revolt. And this is what may have triggered off a lot of the Arab revolt. There's a correlation between food prices on the street and the countries where a revolt was triggered. Egypt, very much so. Now, what does this mean? We look at Egypt now a year later. Food prices are still high. Worse, because the government has been so unstable, a lot of their capital has fled out of the country. Their ability to stand the shocks and buffets that the economy may take in the next few years is much reduced. Same time, tourism. Tourists don't go to places where there's riots in the street like that. And it also doesn't help when you get some of the Salafists in Egypt proposing covering the pyramids with wax or other things because they're not really Islamic, and the part of the history they'd really pretend wasn't there. So we have this problem again in Egypt that it's still not stable. But the Muslim Brotherhood has been around. They've been sort of fibbing. They're very good gradualists. Are they going to take over the government? Well, they said they weren't. But they said they were only going to run candidates in some 40% of the elections, and then it actually turned out that they ran them in every election. That they weren't going to run someone as a presidential candidate. Well, yes, they did. And we've been seeing Egypt's policies shifting and changing. Egypt is still honoring a lot of its commitments, but there's a lot of them that's not honoring. And there's another weird little construction that you sometimes get in Islamic countries. This is the defense that Iran used to pull off in the 1980s when Iranian government agents were committing terrorism. And Iran would go, well, they're Muslims. It's not our duty to tell a Muslim how he should actually obey God's commandments. So it's not government policy if one of our civil servants committed an act of terrorism. It's him deciding that was his Islamic duty. Well, we've seen the same thing in Pakistan, that someone, say a quartermaster, might decide his Islamic duty is to leave the armory door unlocked one night. Or his Islamic duty is to provide training materials to that weird little school up in the hills that no one's supposed to talk about. We'll be seeing that same sort of thing with Egypt, increasingly, every month. And the Israelis are already noticing that, but I think the rest of us will too. Yemen, well, the northwest frontier of Pakistan is ungovernable, has been forever. Yemen, again, for the last 20 years, the government's been about able to exert its major influence inside the major cities. Any hope of actually controlling what goes on inside the countryside has always been remote. And now it's even worse. And again, the Al-Qaeda, well, it's been called affiliates, I call them franchises. But the Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, they are all over rural Yemen, along with some other elements as well. And that is going to be a base area. It's enough that's even got the Saudis concerned and nervous. No one really touched on Lebanon, but again, a major development, Lebanon last year. The government became the shadow cover for Hezbollah Incorporated. So they've got a government they can hide behind and give them plausible deniability for some of their actions. But Hezbollah interests me because they're changing so much. And I sometimes wonder if that's the only good news on the horizon, that there's that point where a terrorist group that engages in criminal activity fundraise eventually tips, becomes more of a criminal society than a terrorist group. And actually, I want to grill some of our Israeli friends here about this particular subject if I have a chance tonight, because I'm wondering if that tipping point, if they're coming anywhere close to that. Syria, fascinating. Problem is, again, Assad is a monster. Yep, almost as much of a monster as his dad, but not quite. Problem is, what's going to replace him? His opposition is very heavily influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Wahhabis are all over it. And the Assad family has largely tolerated the Druze, the Christians, and other minorities inside Syria. What will happen if the Muslim Brotherhood takes over? He's a monster, but he's a goblin. What comes next could be an ogre. What determines our policy then? What do we do? Or do we stand back and hope for the best? We don't know what Syria is going to become. You know, you're not the only one losing sleep over that. I mean, there's, I think, hundreds of thousands of people who are losing sleep over that outside of Syria. This all means, though, again, that we don't know what Syria is going to become. Is it going to become another Pakistan? Is Egypt going to be another Pakistan, where we have a government that we ostensibly play along with, cooperates in some ways, but you're never actually sure if the cooperation is valid? A government that may not control all of its citizens or care to. That'll tell you, yes, it's very firmly against terrorism, and may be very firm against some kinds of terrorism if they affect the national interest, and perfectly willing to turn a blind eye to other forms of terrorism. That is the future that we may be facing. So I think actually when it comes to the Middle East and the future of counterterrorism, the situation has become much, much more complicated. I think the threat environment has increased. There are a couple of other concerns that we shouldn't dispense with entirely. Humanitarian interests. We still have to live the shame down of what we did in the 1930s when there were people scrabbling at our doors and we didn't let them in. Well, what do we do now? I mean, we've been letting in a lot of cops, a lot of other Christians from the Middle East, and they are people that we could use. But there's a lot more that may have to come. And if things really turn bad in Egypt, a Copt may be like a Jew in Germany in 1938. If they don't get out in a year or two, they may never leave and may never be heard from again. I'm not saying that's likely, but it's possible. It's in the cards. Other things that we've not been paying attention to. You know, the Western press is really good at paying attention to things if there's a comfortable hotel nearby. I noticed that the first time I was in Israel in 2004, and I was actually staying in a really great hotel in Jerusalem called the American Colony, which is on the Arab side, and it was full of reporters, which is why they were covering the West Bank so well, because they had a really nice place to go for a drink and a wash-up at the end of the day. Yemen, nobody's there. But there are some reports coming out that there's like a possibility of a catastrophic shortage of water in that whole country. 10 million people without enough to drink. Not theoretically, actually not without enough to drink. What are they going to do? Egypt can't feed itself, hasn't been able to feed itself. Actually, the only country in the Middle East that can probably feed itself is Israel. I really doubt about the rest of them. But Egypt is the worst. Ever since the Aswan Dam, everyone built houses on the best farmland they had. And now they need to import something like about 70% of their food. And their foreign capital is leaving. Their ability to pay for imports is diminishing. You know, there is a potential of a real humanitarian crisis, an absolutely catastrophic one. And we have to pay attention to this. You know, it will be incumbent on us to try and help in some ways, although I don't know what you're going to do if there's 70% of a country of 80 million people can't eat. How the hell can we help that? This is, you know, there's that old Chinese curse, which is also a Scottish curse. You know, may you live in interesting times. And frankly, as far as the Middle East is concerned, I think times couldn't get more interesting than they're about to be in the next few years. Thank you.
Excellent, John, Doug. Thank you very much. You're right. You can take a certain license, and I think it was very, very useful to be able to speak about certain things, and very honestly, frankly, and extremely well informed. Just a couple quick thoughts. I know I've mentioned a theory or a problem we used to have with sharing information with others, and perhaps I'll direct this off the top to John. It is a difficult world. It's one where it's extremely complex. We both agree. There's different approaches, though. How do you manage friends or allies, such as Pakistan? How do you also engage in sharing information that may put people at risk, Canadians at risk, which countries that may have a less than stellar human rights record, or that are just simply because they're complicated entities or complicated governments to be able to manage and trust. Is the option to disengage? Do you put up the barricades and stay clear, or do you engage and try to find ways to mitigate threats?
Oh, sure. Give me the easy questions.
I knew you could handle it.
You know, actually, I guess in this case, you know, this is going to, I'll get on one of my quick soapboxes here, and that's the whole Arar case. You know, the idea that, you know, we sent someone off to Syria where he says he was tortured, came back, and we gave him $10 million. Do we actually accept information that may have been arrived at from torture? You know, that's a very thorny issue, and I could answer that to my own satisfaction, and I think half of you in the room wouldn't, except, you know, because when it's not black and white, there's shades of gray. How gray are you prepared to get? But I think also you really have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. You can't really, I think, have a simple principle that you always stick to all the time, because the real world doesn't work that way. You know, for example, the thing that always bugged me in the Arar case was no one asked him for a medical. No one ever asked him to take his shirt off and show his scars. You know, we just took his word that he was tortured. We've had cooperation from the Egyptian police, who we know are not angels. The Americans have pulled a lot of information out of Pakistan. They've made some major arrests of al-Qaeda members with information they got out of Pakistan. The Pakistani police were very useful in helping them find Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Which then, of course, leads to the other issue that the Americans then waterboarded him. Depends on what you feel about that issue. So I think you can have principles, behavior you'd like. I think there's the idea that you yourself will not engage in terrorism, that you will not, torture, that you will not accept results derived from torture, mostly. But I really sometimes think everything is on a case-by-case basis. And it's the point in intelligence, as you well know when you asked me this question, that you constantly have to grade your source and assess how reliable the information you've got is. And again, it's all murky. There's never really any clear answers.
Doug, maybe a quick question as I sort through all these questions. Thank you very much. Obviously, we've piqued an interest. A number of interests. So I'm just thinking about the issue of the challenge of community policing, the modeling. It goes way back to probably Sir Robert Peel, 19th century UK. You talked a lot about communities, the importance of engaging communities. Is it the same? Is there a perfect parallel between community police? Is this whole outreach thing distinct? Is it different? And is it a better approach than simply dealing with it through a law enforcement outcome? I went back to my early days thinking about the counterterrorism program. I used to motivate a lot of young officers and analysts and say to them, my favorite outcome was a law enforcement outcome, therefore we must be able to transform intelligence into evidence. But given your pass, because you're stuck with the problem, after we identify the threat and we identify the threat vectors of the elements, you get stuck with the challenge. Which is the most effective early approach to mitigating threats?
Thank you for the question, Ray.
This job's easy, actually.
I go back to the basic premise I hope I made during my little chat there, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and certainly there are analogies to be drawn back to the early days, back to Peel. Truly, the most important thing you can have is an engaged community, and that is obviously our first option, to have the community engaged with us so that we can prevent things and be certainly made aware of things that could be causing concern that we can help the community hopefully mitigate. On the second part of the question, clearly there are times when we certainly receive information, be it from the community or be it from another agency such as the service, where we feel compelled to act. And I just want to make it quite clear that depending on the type of the information, if there is information received where we have every reason to believe there is an imminent threat to life, we will act immediately and accordingly. If it's something that's not as immediate, then of course we have to assess, and we proceed by hopefully developing evidence independent of the intelligence that we receive that allows us to proceed with a successful prosecution. So I hope I've answered that question for you, Ray.
Thank you. I'll move to the written questions. I guess to maybe just to do this in a flow, one question to me was, is the CSIS analysis of the security implications of the Arab Spring, is it based on a view that the origins were legitimate and benign, or is it open to treating Muslim Brotherhood takeover of Arab Spring as a greater risk? I guess the first part is, I think John spelled it out as well quite eloquently, is lots of legitimate elements, drivers behind the Arab Spring, I think from the context of those of us who live in democracies. I remember, I'll loosely paraphrase a thought from many years ago, Western civilization is about as deep as about 2.5 missed meals. And I think that probably underlines some of the things those people were feeling as well. Is it benign? No, it's not. It has created a very new and diversified threat. It's allowed threat actors to take full advantage of a permissive environment, and so there will be consequences, absolutely. Is the Muslim Brotherhood the incarnation of evil? I think that's an overly simplistic approach. Everything is gray, or a lot of things are gray, a lot of things are complicated. There are slivers. There are so many different versions of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, and even within Egypt itself, there's a number of factions. We look at things once individuals, cells, groups commit to a path of violence, they are legitimate targets, and we'll engage those targets and generate enough intelligence then to turn it over to our RCMP colleagues or to the international community for actions through the International Criminal Court or elsewhere. Perhaps John here, something refreshingly different, but it does touch on, I talked about the PRC very briefly, but the question is, do the Chinese have challenges with respect to radical Islam? If so, how would you deal with them?
Well, actually, I mean, let's face it, if you look at the history of Islam, they've managed to pick a fight with everyone they've met. And the frontiers of China, in Western China, of course, you've got an Islamic minority who have been, well, the official policy of the People's Republic of China is to convert every area of the country into a Han majority. So they've been moving a majority of their own people into Western China, in the Xinjiang, and this is to the detriment of the Uyghurs, who find that suddenly their towns are all full of ethnic Chinese, the jobs are all full of ethnic Chinese, and they're being discriminated against in their own homeland. And they have lashed out with terrorism that's been directed against Beijing. And to be perfectly honest, it's this is one group actually I can sympathize with in some ways, but again, they're using terrorism rather than conventional protest, and that has the normal ramifications you have to expect. And the other, I guess though, the other guiding point in thinking about the People's Republic of China is you've got to remember one thing in all your dealings with China, is that they are nakedly pragmatic in their self-interest. They do not tend to have the same values that we do. If they will have to get what they need or to get what they want, if they have to deal with a government that suppresses human rights of its citizens, they will. They'll sign the deal enough and go with it. If they have to deal with a terrorist group, yeah, they'll do it. If it's in China's interest, they'll do anything. Does this mean you shouldn't do business with China? Don't be ridiculous. You should. But just be aware of the fact that they will do whatever it takes to meet the huge and growing demand of their own people and to provide a better life for them.
Maybe I'll continue with you, John, just because there are quite a few questions, and a couple of these are linked. They're interesting because it goes back to your initial comment about Pakistan. And it kind of sums up, how can you trust Pakistan in terms of an ally in the war against terror? Do you also believe it'll eventually break up and sort of perhaps face the same challenges on the Arab Spring front? And if so, just from that, and perhaps at the end, a thought about Egypt and that, how can you trust Egypt if some things are said and commitments are no longer verifiable given the changes of government?
There's a problem a lot of countries have, and that's actually that Pakistan is by no means unique in this, and it's that they don't really know who they are. Are they a Muslim country, in other words, a country for Muslim people, or are they an Islamic country? It should be governed by Islamic traditions and Islamic laws, and that they've been fighting over that for decades. Are they a failed state? Well, parts of them have always been a failed state. No government has ever been able to control some parts of the northwest frontier. You have a small political elite that is, and a landed aristocracy and a moneyed elite that are very good at hanging on to their own interests. And they survive year in, year out. And you sometimes wonder how they manage it, but they do. So I think Pakistan will be there for some time to come. But again, as we've seen in the current world, there's occasionally perfect storm circumstances when a number of factors combine together. And a state as weak and as flawed as Pakistan may not survive circumstances that could arise. I mean, a real combination of stronger than normal regional insurgencies, worse than normal international economic climate, the wrong provocation to India at the wrong time, a whole combination of factors. It's always possible. Well, I think Pakistan will be there in 20 years. Yeah, I'll put money on that. Do I think it'll be there in 50? I don't think I'm going to want to cover that bet.
Maybe as a process issue, perhaps we'll stop writing questions, because I'm afraid to start dropping these now because there are probably too many. I think we have probably more than enough to get through the next 25 minutes, 20 minutes. Okay, thank you. That was definitely a tipping point. Here's a question. I'll turn to Doug. It's probably addressed to both of us, but I'll ask you to take the first kick at it. And it's more a question of political correctness. It's a question of our attitudes about, quote unquote, not offending any minorities. Does this, or could this impede your organization or mine from engaging the threat and properly arresting a terrorist?
Sure. Very good question. And my very simple answer to that is absolutely not. If you'll recall, I mentioned that we work with all the communities. We do not target communities per se. What we do target is criminal activity. So I guess if I can be permitted to use the old adage, if the hat fits, then wear it. So to say that we're timid or politically correct, I mean, obviously we're sensitive to the multicultural base of Canada, a country we all love and enjoy, and appreciate the values that we have. But in no way would we be take a position that we felt that was, in any way, shape, or form intimidating a particular community. That's not the objective. What we are intimidating and what our objective is to pursue criminals, and we will do that.
Perhaps I'll just complement that great answer with, from our perspective, since we are well positioned, we have a slightly lower threshold in law enforcement. Our role is to engage an emerging threat. And the first indications of signs, as defined in the Act, the CSIS Act, what is a threat, we can apply the same powers as law enforcement in terms of intercepting communications, do physical surveillance, do surreptitious searches, gather intelligence, which will be able to then allow us to arrive at a conclusion whether or not a group or individual are engaged in threat-related activities. We do that very thoughtfully, but we do that against anybody, anywhere that demonstrates a threat profile. And it's never a question of targeting communities. We never target communities. But given our different way of working, we certainly do have sentinel sources out there. We certainly do develop access sources who are against persons that we already have indicators, or that will, through engagement against those legitimately authorized targets, will uncover a yet undiscovered cell. And that's the way the system works. So it's never a question of even being concerned about whether we're politically correct or not. We simply do our job based on the actions of others. So they bring upon themselves the investigative powers of the state. There's a similar question, this one you're going to love, because it's one of those touchy things about the courts and immigration tribunals and so on. And as a good law enforcement senior officer, it's very, very dangerous territory. So I'm going to let you answer this one. Is there a sense, because Canadian laws and the complex nature of our immigration processes, that we're really incapable of removing individuals who are deemed or believed to be a threat to national security?
Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome.
Again, the answer to that question is that we respect very much the rule of law in Canada. That's the basis in which I guess all Western democracies work, and it's no different here. And without the rule of law, obviously, it would be a very chaotic place to be. What I would say is that we have certainly had success under the current laws that are on the books, and certainly they are, at current times, they're working well, and we certainly work within the parameters of those laws.
Thank you. That was a very difficult question and a very complicated answer to be able to provide clarity on something that's still emerging. The laws in this country are constantly changing and transforming. There's something similar to me here in terms of the what is the percentage of the international Muslim population or those in Canada who hold a sufficiently radical view or that would pose a real threat to social and cultural values in the West. And from that, would you describe Al-Qaeda's mission statement? That's a good one. Let me just, I'll try to sort of jump off of your answer and go into this other part about communities and the percentage thereof. I don't have a clear answer in terms of what percentage. From the practitioner group, I can tell you that we still believe internationally there's a certain high level of understanding and at least perhaps some mild sympathy. Some polling efforts in Canada and elsewhere have indicated that some have at least felt sympathetic to some of the initial 9/11 hijackers. And the numbers are actually even quite shocking in terms of the percentage of the population. But I think that, again, like there are lies and there are darn lies and there are statistics. And I think you have to be very careful when you take a look at these analyses. In Canada, my sense is that the number is extremely small. It's perhaps a fraction of a percent. The problem is, of course, and through our studies of radicalization, it's the demographic that's worrisome. It's young. Look at the Toronto 18 profiles. Unlike what we've seen in the UK and in Spain and elsewhere, and particularly in France, these were not severely marginalized people. Some of them, quite a few of them, were in the middle zone of socioeconomic potential for progress, reasonably educated, all born or arrived here on our shores very, very early age. But they became very attracted to the interesting message. And I think probably the most effective group that does that now is Al-Shabaab. If you go onto the websites and you take a look at the messaging, and as we've reported, there are a number. There are perhaps a dozen young Canadians who are engaged with Al-Shabaab in Somalia currently. They're attracted by the throbbing beat of the music. It's very hip-hop. It's very cool. It entices them to do the right thing, to take on adventure. And for an 18-year-old male who perhaps is not clear about where he fits in a society or whether or not he really wants to go on to college or university, this could be an attractive option. And I remember one of my young analysts reminded me of the South Park. It's pretty bad when the head of intelligence is quoting South Park, but I thought it was pretty good. A bunch of them headed off to Somalia to become pirates. But of course, their image of pirates was really more the swashbuckling type, the Johnny Depp. And when they realized in the middle of the desert, there wasn't much in terms of piracy going on. It was that moment of realization they'd done a horrible thing. Essentially, that's what we're observing in a lot of young males and a few others who are becoming radicalized and becoming problematic.
Yes, and I can certainly comment further on that. It's an area that is of considerable concern to our law enforcement here in the Toronto area, the National Security Section. We've certainly have had cases where youth have been radicalized and have gone abroad. Some of them have, we've learned, have met their demise, and just as Ray correctly pointed out, you know, some arrive there and realize this is not really what I kind of signed up for, so they really weren't radicalized to the extent that they maybe thought they were. What I will point to is that we currently have before the courts, and I won't get into extensive detail, but we successfully mounted an operation in conjunction with our Toronto police partners. We mounted an undercover operation as a result of information that had come in, whereby an individual, again, I'll say a kid, a young man, had completely subscribed to radicalization and was in the process of leaving the country to head abroad to partake in activities with Al-Shabaab. We were able to arrest that individual, and you may have, some of you may have heard that on the press at the time, or in the press at the time, but we were able to arrest that person before he was able to get on the plane and head that way. As I mentioned, the case is still currently before the courts, and we're hoping for a positive outcome, obviously.
Quick, easy answer is a question about how many officers or intelligence agents the CSIS have. Well, in terms of our intelligence officers, we're just a little over 2,000, and that represents a significant increase. We've doubled the number of intelligence officers over the last 8 years. That's through government funding and confidence in our ability to be Canada's early warning system. And it leads me then to the next question, which perhaps Doug and I can answer jointly. The first part is, or I'll sort of paint a concise picture here. How do we, you and I, or our organizations, how do we strike that balance between maintaining and protecting civil liberties against securing our collectivity, our security collectivity? And I'll start off, I'll just give you a couple thoughts, and if you wanted to give your view. It's a very difficult challenge for us, and I've said that, probably used the word challenge many times, and I've often said difficult many times, because it's a very complex business. It's a great business to be in, because all of those young, bright people we've hired, we've attracted some of the best and the brightest. They love complex issues. These are very nuanced. These are very gray. There's very little black and white in our world. But there's also an expectation of Canadians that we will be nuanced, and we will be very, very adept at figuring out what's legitimate activity and what is a direct threat to national security. That line, though, is really, really close. It's a very difficult line. I think it was General Hayden in the U.S. I heard him talking about this just a little while ago, former head of the National Security Agency, the big SIGINT agency in the U.S., and the question was put to him by a CBC reporter in one of those Saturday morning shows was, looking back on the legacy of the 9/11 investigations in the United States, and lots of accusations of going too far, doing too many things against too many people, being too intrusive in the lives of average Americans. And his answer was actually, I thought he really nailed it, because he spoke, I think, for all practitioners in this business. He says, as the head of an agency that got accused of most of this type of mischaracterized activity, I got to say, I could have had a very easy life of it. I could have had my people play south of the line, and if I can use the hockey analogy, staying well beyond the center line and down by your blue line in your own end, and that keeps everybody bureaucratically very safe. No harm. There'll be no bureaucratic harm, no civil rights or human rights infringed. I always made sure my people played right on the edge, because that's what saved lives, and I make no apology for that. So I think it did capture a bit of that very difficult game we play. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's very well stated, Ray. And all I can add to that is that simply we very much cherish the rights of individuals and civil liberties. And I mean, while we represent the police, we too are Canadian citizens, and we very much respect the culture and climate that we live in. And I can't stress enough that always the rights, it's always a fine balance, and like you say, quite correctly, Ray, I mean, it's not always black and white, but generally speaking, you know, it's paramount to maintain the civil liberties of our population. So,
John, a question for you on Saudi Arabia. Other speakers have noted this, and you've made a reference to Saudi Arabia and the work that's been done in terms of prophesizing the Wahhabist ideology. We see Saudi Arabia pumping billions of dollars in sponsoring madrasas in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But how is it that's not being targeted by the West in the war against terrorism?
Well, welcome to the world. It's not just, of course, madrasas and mosques in Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's everywhere, here in this town, too. They're busy everywhere. The dawah is quite international. I am looking forward to the day that Saudi oil wells run dry, and the dawah has no more funding behind it. I just wish it would come a little sooner. In the meantime, of course, I mean, the world needs oil, and if we're not buying their oil, somebody else will be. So, on the other hand, also our economy would really like cheaper oil. So let's develop it. Let's get oil prices down, because the more inexpensive oil is, the less money the dawah has.
What are the, I'll turn this to John again. What are the main dangers facing Canada in the event there's a conflict with Iran?
The problem with trying to actually predict what's going to happen with Iran is every time you write something down in 5 minutes, you find your analysis was wrong. And you find some new fact. And this is a really tricky issue, but I guess first of all, to understand the Israeli point of view, let's face it, Israel is 4.5 times the size of Metro Toronto. There's no room to be wrong about things like nuclear weapons. That's Israel's problem. The rest of the world, I mean, yeah, we can see what would happen if Iran plugged the Straits of Hormuz. Beyond that, I mean, you've also got the Iranian regime that is, well, the average Iranian now is younger than the revolution, has seen the revolution turn the Iranian revolution turn his economy into a complete mess, deny him any sort of reasonable chance at a reasonable income. A lot of them hate it. They know the regime is sustained by brute force and terror. They can't wait for it to go. The regime, on the other hand, knows that it consists of aging revolutionaries who have not achieved their visions, the hopes that they had back in the 1970s, in 79. At the same time, they're very aware that Iranians are very proud people, very proud of their nationality, of their heritage. And so part of it, that's why you get Iran sort of acting like an obnoxious drunk trying to pick a fight in a bar. Because they're hoping that we take a swing at them, because that might get them the sympathy of their own citizens. So and you've seen Iran doing all this sort of trash talking. I mean, they've done things that should have actually generated a conflict. 2 years ago, or I think last year actually, Ahmadinejad actually talked about how there was a $2.5 million reward waiting for whoever assassinated the Saudi king. Sorry, in most times and places, that would have resulted in war. And some of the other behavior they've been up to, and again, I think Tehran is hoping to be attacked. And I talked to a number, I mean, this country is rich in Iranian exiles and dissidents, and there's a lot of interesting information that comes in. Actually, one of the problems that Iran has right now is a lot of the youth are converting to Zoroastrianism. I've even talked to a Baptist minister who's done 2 underground conversion missions in Tehran. A lot of Iranians, so okay, because remember, the Iranian Revolution in 14 centuries, this was the first time in Islam that the clerics were actually running a country. And they made a complete mess of it. And you may find whatever post-revolutionary Iran is, it may not be 100% Islamic anymore. So for us, maybe there's an interest in holding off and hoping that the regime collapses. It's got to collapse someday. But on the other hand, you have to see the Israeli point of view is they can't afford to take the risk that Iran's actually going to have a nuke. So we're in a difficult situation here. I mean, it's probably too late to knock Iran's nuclear weapons program out with a conventional air raid. I think that opportunity passed 4 or 5 years ago. Other measures may delay the program. But I think it's one of these things, again, where in the Middle East we're trying to buy time and hoping for the best result.
Doug, quick thought here on the issue of how do you, if you recognize that if you accept, for example, that the threat from Islamist extremists is real, and that those who believe or follow the Al-Qaeda narrative are represented here in Canada, could you not turn that in a different direction by engaging those who are, quote here, liberal progressive Muslims, especially those who are, quote, unspoken critics of violence, terrorism, and extremely concerned about the safety of Canada?
Thank you, and again, that's a very valid question, and the answer to that is that we, in fact, do actively involve the community leaders. We have been aggressively pursuing this over the course of certainly during my tenure here, and we continue to expand upon that. Just to give you an example, we've met with with leaders of the various communities very recently. The feedback that we've received from these leaders, and indeed in town halls, not dissimilar to a meeting like we're having here or a presentation, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. Another program that we run, I hadn't mentioned, we run a youth academy, and we've just conducted one that was down in I believe it was in the Hamilton area, where we went out and had young Muslim children come in to basically play policeman for a day and to have some idea as to what it is we do. And again, just the engagement of the kids, again, it was a positive response. We go out, we have officers that go out and partake in basketball games, soccer games with the community, and again, this has been successful. But to the point in terms of seeking out leadership, absolutely we do seek out the leadership in the community to engage them in positive dialogue. So I hope that addresses the question of the.
There was one question on Iran that was directed to me, and perhaps I'll quickly address that. I just found it in my Rolodex. Can you provide, or will you provide, CSIS estimate of where Iran is on the road to nuclear WMD? Our estimate is that they are still demonstrating clear intent to develop capability. They have yet to demonstrate that they will, in fact, go to weaponization, is our estimate on that particular question, or in response to that question. There's an interesting one here. In fact, there's two of them that perhaps I'll address quickly because they sort of synchronize, and they're mostly because I just wanted to dispel a couple of myths here. There's a reference to, is it true that CSIS agents paid money to Al-Qaeda leaders not to attack Canadians in Afghanistan? And there's something else here about British involvement getting Wahhabis to pray in Saudi Arabia after the collapse of Sorry, I'll skip that last part, but let me just add that to another piece here about, you mentioned the very important point that it's harmful to underestimate a threat as it is to overstate it. At what point does the perceived paranoid culture that most security agencies operate within, thank you for that, become part of the problem rather than part of the solution? Fair question, because we're dealing with things that we're paid to actually think about worst case scenarios, absolutely. We're paid to look at perhaps human nature and take a look at what people do and try to deduce some sort of rationale or some sort of purpose to their activities. And of course, we're always worried about, because we will be held to the highest level account if we get it wrong, and rightfully so. So we will err on the side of caution from time to time. But clearly, although my wife has thought when we holiday together, she finds me just a little too paranoid in terms of my our own personal security issues, that we're trying to keep the right kind of balance. And then when it comes down to paying agents with respect to not attacking Canadians, I can say unequivocally, absolutely not. It's a case of we will engage sources in Afghanistan and elsewhere. We've operated, as been known publicly, in Afghanistan to run source operations to understand the nature of the threat, to uncover IED operations that were killing Canadian troops, a number of things of that nature. And we've been very, very strong with respect to our tradecraft, ensuring we do the right things. Paying for not getting things done or not for reducing harm has not been part of our repertoire. We're down to about 4 minutes here, so I'll just finish off with a couple questions. I apologize, there are clearly a number. I've been trying to link some of them together. This is a good one for John, another 30-second answer. A very simple question. Can we really have any peace in the Middle East until Israel-Palestine conflict is resolved?
Remember, most of the conflict in the Middle East has been quite independent of Israel and Palestine. There have been more wars between Arab states than there have been with Israel. And again, so many of them, I mean, Osama bin Laden only got around to mentioning the Palestinians, I think not till, 2002, 2003? So, I mean, it wasn't foremost on his mind at all. And of course, the other thing is you got Palestinians who are concerned about Iran's nuclear weapons as well. Last time I was in the West Bank, I was talking to someone who sort of pointed in the direction of the hills and said, Tel Aviv is just over there and my family's here. Yeah, it's, again, everything's more complicated than it seems on CNN.
Funny, I always get anxious when I watch CNN. I don't know why, but my levels of anxiety rise. I'll close off here with a couple more questions. One was directed to me, and I think it's interesting because it does speak to everybody's sense of vulnerability. And it's my views on the attack, and I guess it equally to Doug here with respect to the attack on the Jewish day school in Toulouse, France, is the opinion of the security establishment that the community or other groups are at increased risk, and the point being the potential for copycat crimes. Do you want to take a kick at this from an enforcement perspective and a protection of public order?
Certainly. Certainly the act that was recently perpetrated in Toulouse, France was absolutely incredibly horrific. Our Jewish institutes and Jewish interest of concern, or are they a target? Of course they are. That's not news to anybody here, and it's certainly not news to us. All I would say is that our position is that we maintain the appropriate vigilance. And can I sit here and say to you people unequivocally that that would not happen again? I can't do that. All I can say is that we do everything in our power to ensure, to the very best of our capabilities, that we are vigilant in our constant quest to ensure that we can mitigate threats.
In our side, of course, we play the first role in terms of trying to identify where those threats might emerge. Doug captured it perfectly. We have I've briefed ministers and others and our head of service on these types of questions. It comes down to that threat I described earlier of the lone actor. Some people like to refer to as a lone wolf. We find that's just a little too romantic, and I think it's actually very unfair in a sense that it doesn't give the right sense. People like the perpetrator in Toulouse, or the person believed to have been the one behind the shooting, absolutely horrendous. There is a big responsibility of intelligence organizations, law enforcement, to be as predictive as possible and to try to identify these sort of things. But a young individual, as we saw with Anders Breivik in Norway, who is extremely smart, who did an incredible complex series of attacks with a complete political agenda and manifesto, with an outcome that he designed and executed to perfection, is really, really hard to uncover. Especially when an individual like that works completely in isolation, works completely alone, and is very crafty and has a number of resources at his or her disposal. These sort of incidents will remain, sadly, a strong potential. But rest assured, we're very attuned to this. This is one of the most important issues for us, and it's one of the things that we share as much as possible and as quickly as possible, everything that deals with threat to life. And we do so with absolute immediacy. And we're very confident that we can keep Canadians safe and secure. I guess that we should conclude. I think we're right at the mark of 5 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you for my co-panelists.